Was war the only option for Israel? Putting aside the events that led up to Hamas' attack, was there realistically any option that Israel had besides declaring war? Were there any diplomatic avenues they could take? And would Hamas even have been willing to negotiate? Was there any chance that Hamas' attack wouldn't start a war? And if not, was that their intent from the beginning? I just don't see an end for this. Even if Israel managed to eradicate Hamas, the suffering of current conflict will ensure another radicalized group will swiftly enter the power vacuum. This is a war of revenge, not one of solving any problem. No politician from any country could respond to an attack like that diplomatically. Imagine George W. Bush on 09/12/2001 saying, "We are prepared to meet al-Qaeda and discuss grievances and come a peaceful understanding." He would have been impeached. Putting aside the events that led up to Hamas' attack. Yeah, probably. Not putting aside the events that led up to Hamas' attack. Hell no. And this is what needs to be focused on. You can't really negotiate with a group after they murder 1,300 people. Does this really need to be said? I'm no fan of Israel, but when one side attacks, there isn't much one can do but fight back. No. This was an outright invasion. Any country that is invaded by armed forces of another country is entitled and should declare war. And to answer your other question, Hamas is not in the business of negotiating. They are in the business of Jew killing. So, war it is. I think war is the only option. But Israel has a lot of choices on how to conduct the war, which will impact how many civilians are killed and injured, but also how many of their own troops are killed or injured. So far they seem to be fairly indifferent to civilian casualties and would rather kill 1,000 Palestinians than risk the life of one of their soldiers. Whole thing is a mess. Nothing is black and white. I think the vast majority of people on both sides want peace and to live their lives. But those in power just want more power. So the guy who led the Hamas terrorist attack had been let go by Israel in a hostage exchange. They exchanged that guy for hostages, who then raped and killed civilians and took more hostages. That is why we don't negotiate with terrorists. And why Israel will never and should never negotiate with Hamas ever again. So yes, war was the only answer. Hamas thought they could take hostages and keep the cycle going. And like terrorists do, they miscalculated. Hamas denies Israel's right to exist. You can't negotiate with someone whose sole purpose is to obliterate you. How many of your neighbors need to be killed, raped, or kidnapped before you see violence as the only option? Why and how Hamas came to be will give you an answer and a better perspective of how this terror can be managed. They were invaded. By doing nothing you'd encourage more. Do you have another suggestion? What war? Palestine doesn't have an army. And the population doesn't have food, water, or electricity. Israel is a small country. I read that if terrorists attacked America proportionally, they would have killed 40,000 Americans. Let that sink in. War is the only decision Israel can do unilaterally. Having two states against each other so geographically close is always gonna be a logistical nightmare. Especially how Israel is sandwiched between two sides. Only way this could work out is to basically empty out Palestine. Which can be done either by rest of the world taking in its people or Egypt and Jordan taking in the parts as their own. Because people there and government there won't be happy being ruled by Jews. Realistically, if Israel ended their occupation and gave the Palestinians freedom, it would undercut the support and rationale behind Hamas while still enabling Israel to launch attacks versus Hamas. If Palestinian freedom were actually delivered and Hamas were fighting against it, Israel might even find an ally in Fatah that they could use to replace Hamas and remove its support. This was their goal, to expel more Palestinians. Israel was warned by Egypt and the CIA. Also, some of our own Congress bought military stocks back in late September after their briefing. Hamas was created by Israel and took on a life of its own. A monster they created, and now it's a phantom they can manipulate to take more land back. Why are they bombing hospitals when they know their own people could be in them? Both Israelis and Palestinians are collateral damage. Israel certainly could have negotiated for the hostages. Israelis are enraged with Netanyahu right now for refusing to do just that. Israel can also just end the occupation and make reparations, which is the ongoing cause of all this. Yes, 1,300 people, women and kids all, in a day is horrifying. Anything other than a violent offensive into Gaza is an insane delusion. This is like asking if breathing is the only option for you while going about your day. In what universe would any country respond differently? The wisdom or morality of war is beside the point. You inhabit planet Earth in 2023. Perhaps this question would make sense when posed to an imaginary society in another galaxy 10,000 years from now. Can you think of an elected government with a massive conventional military advantage responding to an attack like this with anything other than war? It's contrary to everything we know about Homo sapiens. Supporting Hamas because you care about Palestine is like supporting the Taliban because you care about Afghanistan. Jen Cohen. The answer is no. Israel has lost 0.2 of its population, mostly civilians. It is equivalent to around 60,000 people murdered in the States in one day. Guess what Biden would announce should this happen? There's declaring war. Understandable. Warn the civilians. Locate the militants. Cut off arms supplies. Sabotage military comms. Take out soldiers and their leaders. It takes a few weeks to set up and is hard. Then there is option B: immediately launch a zillion missiles indiscriminately into everywhere all at once. And hope your enemies might be among all the dead people. Their intent was to make Israelis feel unsafe. And they did it. Of course, Israel had other options. They were never going to use any though. They are a racist, brutal, fascist state. They were already committed to committing a long, slow genocide because it was cheap, and they were fine with the casualties at the current level. They had the support of most Western democracies too. Once the illusion of safety was punctured, then they were embarrassed and lashed out. They have no reason to think that any of the countries who were funding their slow genocide would complain about accelerating it, and so it has proved. Hamas is always willing to talk, and they are fairly good to their word. But their demands tend to be ridiculous, and Israel would have no intention of meeting them. Hamas would have wanted an agreement for the hostages and other concessions that would have looked a lot like a petty surrender. That would have bought Israel perhaps a few years before their next attacks, which would have been far worse since Hamas would now have better weapons. So I'd say there was no reasonable diplomatic option. But yes, a mild surrender was available to Israel for a stall. Israel has created an enemy that will never simply give up. It's too late. It's hopeless. Either Israel will commit genocide and eliminate the Palestinians while the West looks the other way, or other Middle East countries will help the Palestinians commit genocide against Israel while the West looks the other way. Only once the West disengages from the area can one of these two scenarios happen.